Okay, today we are going to begin reading through the book of Acts. I don't know how far exactly we're going to get today, but the plan is to read through Acts 14, and then we're going to take a stop and read the book of Galatians, because that's about the period of time in which Galatians would have been written. And then we're going to go back to Acts and read through Acts 17, and we're going to go and read 1st and 2nd Thessalonians, and we're going to continue on from there. We did this basic kind of pattern back when we were doing the Old Testament, and we were reading through the history books of the Old Testament, and whenever we got to one of the prophets, we would stop and we would go read the book of the prophet, and then we would go back to the Old Testament history books of Kings and Chronicles. So we're going to be doing that too. We're going to be doing that pattern. We're going to be following that same pattern here as we finish the rest of the New Testament. Acts is a history of of what we would call the New Testament period after the departure of Jesus into the heavens and the formation of the church, continuing on for the next 30 or so years. And during that time, most of Paul's letters would have been written. And it's actually pretty easy to figure out when Paul's letters would have been written in the context presented in Acts. So we're going to stop when we get to these points and read those letters. So it'll take us a while to get all the way through Acts, because after we get to the first half, we're going to be stopping frequently to read one of Paul's letters. Most of the letters of Paul, with a couple of exceptions, can be fairly easily fitted into the context of the timeline of Acts. But now, of course, the letters would have been written before Acts, just so we know. Acts would have been written after that period of time was over. So we're reading the events, we're reading a timeline of events in the order in which they happened, but this is not the order in which the books would have been written, because Acts would have been written after most of the letters of Paul. We're not going to be getting into Paul a whole lot yet, though, because he figures primarily in the second half of Acts. We're going to be focusing on the first 14 chapters. There are 28 chapters in Acts. I don't know how far we'll get today. Okay, I don't know if we'll be able to get through. I doubt we'll be able to get through all 14 chapters in one day, but that is the goal, is to get through Acts 14 and then go on to Galatians, and so we'll go on from there. Acts is the second part of a two-part volume. He is the same guy who wrote Acts also wrote the Gospel of Luke, which we've already read, and he doesn't identify himself by name, but the author identifies this work as the second half of a two-part volume, or the second installment of a series that he had been writing for someone named Theophilus. It's the same author and the same audience, and probably the same context too. Luke does not identify himself by name, but history identifies him as Luke. It does identify his audience as Theophilus, and is addressing both his gospel and the book of Acts to this Theophilus person. Acts is a little difficult at first to determine exactly what it is as a book. Like, what is this book? Why? What is it for? What is its purpose? What is it trying to do? As we read, it'll be a history of the formation of the church in the early acts of the church when it's still in Jerusalem, and continuing out from there. It isn't really until we get to the second half of Acts, which, like I said earlier, we're not going to do today, that we really start to see Luke's purpose in writing Acts. Because as Acts goes on, it becomes more and more specific legal defense for Paul as he is about to face trial in Rome. And in fact, the book of Acts ends with Paul still in Rome awaiting trial. So that is kind of the context of Acts. So and it'll become very clear as we get through the book, as we go through the book of Acts, that Luke is writing this to exonerate Paul and by extension Christianity in general from the charges that have been brought against it by the Jews, and going to present their case against Paul in front of Caesar. So which in turn indicates that Theophilus, the person to whom Luke is writing in both this volume and Luke, the Gospel of Luke, is probably some kind of official who is in charge of background information, or maybe even a defense attorney for Paul in Paul's court case. And we mentioned as we read the Gospel of Luke that possibly it's harder to see in the Gospel of Luke. Acts is very apparent, especially as you read through Acts. It becomes very clear that a big part of Luke's focus is on defending and exonerating Paul. It's a little harder to see that, to read that meaning back into the Gospel of Luke, but one way that you can, and we mentioned this as we read the Gospel of Luke, one way that you can is to see that is the parallel. First of all, Luke was compiled probably with the information available in both the Gospel of Mark and Matthew already, so it was shaped to a large extent by the material that Luke had available to him, which would have already been the existing Gospels, I think, of Matthew and Mark. But also, you can see the way he shapes the information to present the whole book as around Jesus' last journey to Jerusalem, where he gets arrested and convicted and crucified. And how Acts then becomes that as well when Paul begins his last journey to Jerusalem in the second half of Acts, which ends with his arrest and imprisonment, but not necessarily in his conviction and execution, which is the fate that Luke is attempting to avoid, I think, by writing its defense. So you do see some evidence in the Gospel of Luke that it was written for the same purpose as Acts, although it is harder to point out there. It is harder to pull that out of Luke. Acts, it becomes very obvious. In general, Luke is writing to defend Christianity. It's not just about Paul. Paul is the one who's going to Rome to face Caesar, so he becomes like the representative example of the test case. But it's not just about Paul. Luke is attempting to defend all Christians in the eyes of the Roman legal system from the charges being brought against them, primarily by the Jews, who do not like the Christian movement that has splintered off from mainstream Judaism and are trying to cause trouble for them. And so throughout the book of Acts, and throughout the New Testament in general, consistently the primary opponents of the church throughout the New Testament would have been we would call them temple Jews, Jews who did not convert to Christianity, did not follow Jesus, and still follow the Mosaic law and circumcision and all that. And that's going to be the context not only of Acts, but throughout most of the New Testament. We read about this a little bit when we read the Epistle of James, and we read about the rich people who were causing trouble for them. And it's probably wealthier Jews in the areas who were causing trouble for the poorer Christian Jews, non-Christian Jews who wanted to remove the Christian Jews from the synagogues or take their land. We saw this also in John, the Gospel of John. A number of instances where characters were described as being put out of the synagogue or being afraid of being put out of the synagogue. And that was a threat that the Jews could wield against their fellow Jews. And to do that, and to be put out of the synagogue, not only kind of cut you off from your community and your support group and your people and all that, but it also left you vulnerable to legal trouble from Rome, because Judaism was accepted within Rome as a legal religious system. Jews were exempt from having to participate in the state worship and religious ceremonies of Rome. Different emperors were more or less strict with that policy at different times, but throughout the New Testament period, Jews were not required to follow by and large, were not required to follow the Roman religious system, whether it's worshiping the emperor as God or the Son of God, or worshiping, Jupiter and Zeus, the Greek gods, because they were still prominent in the Roman culture. It's like Jews were exempt from having to do all that. And so if you were a Jew who became a Christian and now you're non-Christian Jewish family member, were forcing out of the synagogue, not only would that be a loss of fellowship with them, but it would also be a loss of legal protection against having to participate in the Roman religious system, which of course you couldn't do. You can't declare that Jesus is Lord, also declaring that Caesar is Lord. And that became a real problem. Now, eventually, the Romans themselves would be the problem. Later on in history, the Jewish opposition to the Christian message faded away and was no longer a significant threat. If anything, the Christians eventually became threats to the Jews. But the Romans themselves became a problem later on. And in the book of Acts, and in much of the New Testament in general, but in the book of Acts we're talking about here in particular, there's no hint of this. There's no indication anywhere in the book of Acts that the Christians were having any kind of problem with Rome itself yet. I think you can tell that they knew that they would probably have problems with Rome eventually, which is why Luke is so determined to kind of cut off any potential avenue to that. I have a cat who just wants to bother me. I have to constantly just fiddle around with this cat all the time. There he is. But as of the time of the writing of Acts, I don't think this has happened yet. And that is why I believe that Acts ends basically when it seems to say that it does. At the end of the book of Acts, it says that Paul had been in prison in Rome for 2 years, awaiting trial in front of Caesar. And I think it pretty much ends there. I think we can date that pretty well. That's when the book of Acts ends. It's possible, and some have suggested this theory, that the book of Acts was written after this point, and the writer of the book of Acts knows what happened. See, if the book ends with Paul still in prison in Rome, and that's when it was written, then the writer doesn't know yet how that's going to turn out, because Paul, has not yet presented his case in front of Caesar, and so the resolution to that problem has not yet happened. I believe that's probably the simplest and likeliest explanation for when Acts was written. Some people would say that, well, it was actually written after that, and the writer does know what happened to Paul. Paul would have been executed by this point. I mean, the idea is that Paul's court case did not go well, did not result in his exoneration and release. It did result in his execution. And so Luke just doesn't mention that. He cuts the narrative off there and doesn't mention that, which kind of makes its own level of sense when you think about it. You know, you don't want to spoil the story with the sad ending of the chief proponent of Christianity losing to Rome and being, the Jews convinced the Romans to execute him. Like, you don't want that to be kind of a downer ending, so you just don't mention that. You just cut off there. But again, like I said, I don't think that really fits the overall tone and vibe of both Acts and Luke, in which Luke, the author, is doing his best to present the Romans in the most positive light possible. That even goes back into the Gospel of Luke, another subtle indication of that Gospel's real purpose. Luke consistently portrays the Romans as being friendly, or at the very least not hostile, and frequently it's actually the Roman officials and their magistrates and their centurions that are rescuing the Christians from these angry mobs of zealous Jews, of whom Paul was originally one. And it's just hard for me to believe that Luke would have had that attitude, especially with the very high likelihood or possibility that the guy he was writing to, Theophilus, was himself a Roman official. It's just very hard for me to believe that Luke would have had that very positive attitude and outlook to the Roman officials consistently throughout both volumes, if he knows, as he's writing these, that they end up siding with the Jews against the Christians, putting Paul to death. And as far as I am aware, studying the history of that time, there was no mass movement there was no mass movement against the Christians on the part of the Roman authorities for the sake of assisting the Jews in getting rid of them. Like, that didn't happen. In history, that didn't happen. In fact, the Jews and the Romans are but by the time the book of Acts ends, the Jews and the Romans are very close to embarking on full-out war with each other. That would happen only a few years after Acts ends. And that would be the end of the Jewish state. That war would end up resulting in the destruction of the Jewish state. And so there's no moment in time in which the Romans and the Jews teamed up with each other against the Christians, as would be indicated by Caesar ultimately ruling again in favor of the Jews against Paul. And thus, Paul was a test case. It wasn't just about him. Okay, It was less, he was the representative example, but the ruling that applied to Paul would have applied to all the Christians at that time. And so there's no indication that the Romans and the Jews ever teamed up to go after the Christians together during the 60s AD when this would have happened. In fact, they were about to embark on a lot of civil war, and the Romans would go after the Christians. Emperor Nero, the guy who's going to rule Paul's case, would go after the Christians a couple of years after the ending of Acts, but for his own personal reasons, and that had nothing to do with trying to mollify or please the Jews. So there's just no, I have, in the end, while it does make a certain level of sense that Paul, because we know that Paul was in prison in the early 60s AD in Rome, around 61, 62 AD. And we know that just a couple of years later, in 64 AD, there was a great fire in Rome that Nero, the emperor, same guy who judged Paul's court case, blamed on the Christians and used as an excuse to go after them, at least the ones living in Rome at the time. So a couple of years later, and it would have happened, and Paul does end up dying in Rome at some point in time. The letter of 2 Timothy is written by Paul while he is in prison in Rome and ready for and waiting to be executed, knowing that he's going to be executed this time. So he does end up being executed in Rome after serving at least a short sentence in prison there. Who knows how long. That does happen. The question is, does it happen at the time that Acts ends, or does it happen a few years in the future? My best estimation, having looked at the timeline and all the available evidence, is that Paul's imprisonment in Rome, as recorded in Acts, does not end in his execution. He does, in fact, get released. It's not recorded in Acts because Acts was written before that happened. He then goes off and does whatever it is he does, and we don't know what he did after that, really, for 4 or 5 years. Eventually ends up getting arrested and imprisoned in Rome again in 66 or 67 AD, and this time he is in fact put to death. This time he doesn't make it out. And so that's to me the best context and timeline. So which means Acts would have been written about 62 AD. Luke was written first, so it would have been written sometime before that, at that time or just before. And there, and Acts also ends with Paul and Luke. Luke is with Paul the entire time. He's not arrested himself, but Luke is with Paul the entire time. So Paul is in prison for 2 years in a southern city in Judea, and then goes to Rome and is there for 2 years. And during that time, Luke would have had plenty of time and opportunity to gather information for his gospel and the material found in Acts. So it makes the most sense of how all these books came together and how all these movements fit together. That is an overview of the book. We're going to actually, but that is, again, that's all going to happen later. That's kind of a preview of the second half of Acts, and we're only focused on the first half today. Before we even get to Paul, we got to go through Peter and the other original apostles, because the church didn't start with Paul. And so the first half of Acts is focused on Peter and the original apostles as they carry out the mission given to them by Jesus and are empowered to complete that mission through the Spirit that Jesus promised all of the Gospels he would give them. All of the Gospels, Jesus promised he would give them his Spirit. That's going to happen. They're going to be empowered by his, indwelt and empowered by his Spirit, and they're going to begin carrying out the mission that Jesus gave for them to carry out. And that's really what the first half of Acts is about. And all the Paul stuff I just mentioned is going to come along later. But we're talking about a book that covers a period of time from about the early 30s AD to the early 60s AD, so about 30 years of history, about 30 years of time, focusing in the first half on Peter and the original apostles, and then the second half on and their ministry to the Jews, and then to the areas around Judea. And then we switch to Paul, focus on him as he carries the mission beyond that to the wider Gentile world. And that is and that includes Luke. Luke will actually join the story himself when Paul sets out away on his own independent Gentile journeys. Luke is going to actually be one of those people who comes along during that time. He's going to start talking about we. Once we get to Acts 16, there's going to, instead of it all being about they, them, he, whatever, we're going to start seeing these references to we, indicating that Luke himself, the author, who identified himself, not by name, but by the first person I to Theophilus and the intro to this book and Luke. He's finally going to become an actual character in the story himself later on. So he was in that wider Gentile mission, apparently. And so we're going to be retracting the development of that and the course of that as it leads up to Paul's confrontation in Rome. And by doing that, we're also going to get the spine of the context and chronology for the vast majority of the letters that Paul wrote. There's a couple that don't fit easily into the timeline context as presented in Acts, but of his 13 letters, I think 11 of them can be pretty easily fitted into the context of Acts, so we'll be doing that as we go. Okay, so that is the intro to the book of Acts, and next we're going to begin reading it.